Connie Regan Blake has been to every single National Storytelling Festival. She has served as MC, she has served as featured storyteller. She knows lots of storytelling history from this particular festival, and most of it is wrapped around a beloved figure, Mr. Ray Hicks. Mr. Hicks was a mountaineer. He helped us appreciate the roots of American storytelling with traditional tales told in a traditional way. Connie had a long and happy relationship with Mr. Ray Hicks over a number of years, and she is going to share some of that marvelous history that we have all come to treasure at the National Storytelling Festival.
I am so delighted to have you here and to be sharing the stage once again with Ray Hicks. Now, a lot of you might know him, others you will soon. He's actually 1 inch taller. He was 1 inch taller than this shows. Gives you an idea of that. First off, I'm going to take us back to the early 1970s. I had spent a year and a half hitchhiking and backpacking over in Europe. I don't recommend that for any children here. But I came back to the States, and I went to visit my cousin, Barbara Freeman, and she told me that her library at the Chattanooga Public Library, they were looking to hire a storyteller. Very innovative. She said, "I think you can do it." Well, I thought, I had graduated in degree with political science, which some people say is a good background for storytelling. But she told me that I'd be working with preschoolers, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. Well, I'd never worked with young children, but something about it struck a chord. It resonated with me, and I thought, yeah, maybe I could do this. Plus, it was only funded for 9 months. Then I could make a little money, look good on my resume as a real job, then I could take off with my backpack again. So I went in and applied for the job. I got it, and I loved it. Within 2 or 3 weeks, I knew that storytelling was going to be a part of my life the rest of my life. The city picked up the funding after 9 months, and so I continued telling to the children and also to adults, sometimes at folk music festivals and such. Then I heard from a friend. She said that there was going to be a storytelling festival in this tiny town up in Tennessee, East Tennessee. And I thought, a storytelling festival? I'd never heard of that before. I've been to plenty of folk music festivals, but one devoted to storytelling? And they were calling it the first National Storytelling Festival? I thought that was really brazen. But I wrote that man over there, Jimmy Neal Smith. I said, "I'm a storyteller." He wrote me right back and said, "Come on up and we'll put you on stage." Well, I got my cousin Barbara. She had a little yellow truck, and we headed up here. Sunday afternoon, October 14th, 1973, right downtown next to the courthouse, there were 60 chairs set up. And in front of those chairs, there was a flatbed truck with bales of hay. There were some politicians who told some not-so-funny jokes. There was a little bit of music. And then they introduced this mountain man, Ray Hicks. He came up the steps. He was so tall, ramrod straight. That microphone looked like a giant silver praying mantis in front of him. He stepped up to the mic, and it was like he was telling to the heavens. And here we were, right in front of him, taking it in. But he started talking, and my first thought was, wait, I don't understand this man. I'm not, is it English? I think it's supposed to be English. Maybe it is, kind of. And then somehow I dropped in and I started hearing. I've come here to tell yous a Jack tale, one I got from my granddaddy. Benjamin is about Jack and the heifer hide. I'm glad to be here to tell to yous. And he started in. Well, I went into a different world. My eyes, my heart, my ears were totally connected to this man on stage. Somehow, I listened through the whole story. I heard, and Jack, him and his mom doing right well. I was still in that world. And then I heard my name being announced. I was next to tell. Somehow I shook my head and kind of came back to this earth and walked up on the stage and told a story. Well, as soon as that afternoon was over, Barbara and I went over to meet Ray and his wife, Rosa. Rosa and I connected right away, all 5 feet of her standing right there. She was kind of quiet, but she also had this undertone of being a feisty mountain woman. We kind of liked each other right away. And then Ray and Rosa and Barbara and I started walking around town, all 3 streets. And as we were walking, as soon as we started walking, Ray started in telling about old Wicked John, how he lived up in the mountains. He is a blacksmith, working over hot coals of fire, had on a leather apron made out of mule skin. Once again, I was transported. And then afterwards, we exchanged addresses. Rosa and I started a correspondence. I started visiting the Hicks. And I'd always loved to hang out with Rosa in the kitchen and also sit on that front porch or in the front room where the wood stove was and take in Ray's stories. He became my mentor, my friend, and we were like family. You know, this land here, the Southern Appalachians, it was the eastern ancestors of the Eastern Cherokee that lived here 1,000 years ago and ever since. They're still living here, the Cherokee are. And it was much later, 1700s, that some of the Europeans started coming over here. The Irish, the English, Scottish. They found these mountains and fell in love. It reminded them of home. And along with their trunks and quilts, they also brought their stories. Well, Ray was of that lineage. The Hicks family lived on land that had been in their family since the 1700s. And 100 years ago, Ray's daddy and granddaddy built a clapboard house for the family. No electricity, no running water. There's a spring house outside. That wood stove heated every bit of it. And there were 11 children, Ray and his 10 brothers and sisters. Life was hard. It was a struggle. You know, if there was a hard summer, too much rain, not enough rain, it could mean starvation the following year, the following spring. But right alongside that hardship, there was also joy and lots of stories. When all those Hicks kids were doing their chores, shelling peas and husking corn, sitting out on the front porch, it was their great-grandma who also was telling stories right along with their granddaddy, Benjamin. And they'd tell stories, the old traditional stories, all about Jack. And Ray told me, he said, he'd listen and laugh so hard his eyes would just fill up with tears. When he was only 5 years old, he started retelling those stories that he had heard. And you know Jack. He's in stories all over the world. Jack is that one that at first seems to be not so smart. A little maybe loose up there. I mean, he trades a good cow Milky White for a few little old beans, but he ends up with a pot of gold. And that's who Jack is. There's stories about him with giants and ogres and Jack, he always takes care of his mama. Well, now, once it was in April. Ray was a child, and a late winter storm raced through where they lived on Beach Mountain. It was just like in an instant. Snow covered everything. The wind was howling. Now, it happened because it was late April. The wood pile was empty. So was the cupboard. There was nothing left that had been canned the year before in the root cellar either. The wind was just howling, and Ray's daddy, he was off the mountain. Ray's mama, it was just too much for her. She thought all of her children, her hungry children, were going to starve that night. So she went to bed, cried herself to sleep. It was Ray, and he wasn't even the youngest, oldest, only 9 years old. It was Ray that somehow had it in him to get up and go outside. Maybe he's thinking about Jack. What would Jack do? He went outside and started digging up under the snow. Everything was covered already with a lot of snow. He started digging up under it, found a few limbs here and there, and he got enough wood. Get that wood stove started. And he kept the family alive that night. Now, it wasn't too much longer after that Ray quit school to work in the fields. Now, the Hicks always depended on what they grew to feed them. That's what they lived on. And if they happened to have a little bit of money, maybe for sugar or a little bit of coffee, things we take for granted, leather for shoes in the winter, that did take cash. But over and above that, hanging over their heads all the time was paying land taxes. If they wanted to keep that land in their family, they had to pay land taxes, and they had to have cash to do that. Well, people in the family really kept looking to Ray. They depended on him. And then Ray found a precious jewel. He got a job, an ongoing job. It wasn't just for a day or two that would pay him cash. It was what he called lumbering. Now, a neighbor friend loaned him a truck that he could get back and forth from where he lived down to where he had to report in for work. Well, one night, he was coming home, got pretty close to home, and the engine stopped. Well, Ray got out and popped up the hood and looked, and his family didn't have any engines. He didn't know anything about how it worked. Neither did the neighbor who owned the truck. Ray made sure things were tightened and looked at the wires. He got back inside the cab, tried to start it up, and nothing. Now, Ray knew if he didn't show up for work, there'd be a long line of people waiting for that job. Times were hard in the mountains. And he knew if he didn't show up, he'd maybe lose it totally. He walked home with a real heavy heart. And that night, when he went to bed, he said just a short prayer. he asked for a little bit of help. And in the middle of the night, he opened his eyes, he woke up, and on the ceiling of his room was the entire inner workings of a combustion engine. It was in 3D. He could see where the gas was coming into the carburetor. He could see the pistons going up and down and firing, and he saw how it all worked. He got up in the morning, walked up to the truck, fixed it, and headed on down into town. Now, it wasn't long after that Ray met Rosie Violet Harmon, the love of his life. And they fell in love, and they got married. They lived in that same clapboard house that Ray was born in and lived all of his life, really. And they still used that spring house, no water inside, so they had an outhouse. And eventually they got some electricity, but Rosie, she still cooked on that wood stove in the kitchen. And they had 5 children. And they all worked hard, making sure that they could get by and somehow make enough money for the land taxes and such. Now, Ray, when I look back on it, one of the ways that I'll tell you first, one of the ways that they made money was Ray was really good at finding ginseng. You know, that was and is still a treasured herb that grows here in the mountains. The Chinese were really hungry for it. They used it in almost all of their medicines. It was another hidden jewel. And so Ray and the kids would collect ginseng. Another one was galax leaves. Shiny green leaves, kind of a short, sturdy stem. The leaf is almost heart-shaped. And florists all around the United States use these leaves to put into floral arrangements. So wholesalers were always around the mountains looking to buy some of these galax leaves. One of Ray's sons told me that they'd go out. Everybody in the family would go except one. Somebody always stayed in the house. They felt like the house almost was like another person. So somebody always was there with it, never had a lock on it. But everybody else would go out, the grandmother too, and they'd find a whole area of galax. And the kids and the parents, they'd all start picking. Once they had 25 leaves, had to count them up, they'd get a string and tie it around tight. And then Grandma would hold open a flour sack, and you'd drop that bunch of leaves right in there. Then you'd pick 25 more and tie them up, and 25 more and put them in there, and more, until that bag was full. 7,000 or 8,000 galax leaves. No telling how long it took to get that bag full. And they'd get $14 for that. But the Hicks family has always been good at doing whatever it is needs to be done to keep it going. Now, you know, when I look back at that first festival, and I think about Ray, this mountain man, coming down with old-time gifts to share with us modern folks, I know that it impacted my life in incredible ways. And it also impacted the whole storytelling revival, the whole possibility of a storytelling revival, because Ray captured the imagination of everyone. The way he talked, the way he dressed, the way he told stories as if everybody in the audience was sitting on his front porch. The media took interest, local, regional, national. Everybody started spreading the word about this storytelling festival. And the dream that our founder, Jimmy Neal Smith, had to breathe new life into this fading town of Jonesboro, it was working. 60 people at that first festival, 150 at the second, and then before long, 1,000, and then before too long, 10,000 people coming from all over the world, gathering here year after year as if it were a family reunion and everyone knew each other and were related. That's the way we feel at this festival. And I believe that Ray knew he had become the face of this storytelling revival. But you know, the Hicks family never really profited from it. They were invited to other festivals, but really, Ray and Rosa liked to stay at the home place. And the world came to them. Whenever I was up there, you never knew who might pull up. It could be a filming crew from the CBS Evening News. It could be the LA Times, a journalist coming, National Geographic, the New Yorker, all wanting to come and meet this man. Who was he? From another world, from another time. A linguist, I once met a linguist that had come over from England to study the old-timey ways that Ray spoke. He said it was kind of a very different dialect. And he would write down things and listen and record him and such. He said, one anthropologist said that George Washington and Daniel Boone would have been comfortable talking with Ray. One time I was up there and Ray had told me that he is out in the field and working, and he saw a big, shiny black car pull up on the road. The house set down just a little bit from the dirt road. And Ray said, I seated up there, and I started walking, heading for the front porch. When I got there, this man, all dressed in a suit, had on a hat, middle of the day. He introduced himself, said he'd come all the way from California. This man was from a TV show, The Tonight Show. He said to Ray with kind of a flourish, I've been sent here to ask you to come and be on the Johnny Carson show. Now, Ray didn't have a TV, no radio. He wasn't in that world at all. But Ray, he just smiled and he said, well, you tell Johnny, if he wants to come here, I'll tell him about Jack. Now, it was long about that time, in 1975, that my cousin, Barbara Freeman, and I, we quit the jobs that we loved at the Chattanooga Public Library, and we headed out to become full-time freelance storytellers. Now, we got that yellow truck, same one that had brought us up here for the first festival, and we put a little topper on it, and a friend put in a wooden floor. That would be our bed. Barbara and I put our yoga mats and sleeping bags on that floor. Right up above the cab, there was a little bit of space where we could store a few things. And underneath that wooden floor, that's where we kept some canned vegetables and a little propane stove so we could eat as we traveled on. Now, when we quit our library jobs, we knew we wanted to be storytellers, but we had no idea you could make a living telling stories. I mean, who would have thought that? So we had a few backup plans. One was we thought we'd learn how to be semi-truck drivers. And we thought while one was driving, the other could be working on stories. Then we'd swap off, as we traveled around, we'd collect stories and maybe tell a few. And, well, fortunately, that never happened. Fortunately for the road and for us. Because right away, we started getting paid to tell stories. We started off after we left the library. Less than a month later, we found ourselves up in New York, upstate New York, near Poughkeepsie, and we had 2 tickets to the Fox Hollow Music Festival. We had found a campground nearby, Little Hoosic River Campground. Turned out that was not the best decision because the rains came and the Little Hoosic flooded and the campground was flooding, and at 5 o'clock in the morning somebody was knocking on our camper saying, "You gotta leave, you gotta leave." So we pulled out of there. We didn't drown. And it turned out that the festival folks had us come and park our camper where all of the festival performers were. Well, at night, we rolled out our little canopy on our truck, built a little fire, and folks started gathering around, and we started telling stories. Well, one of those people ran a festival, the Connecticut Folk Festival. It was happening the next week, and invited us to come. Said they'd put us on stage if they had time. They did. We went. And it turned out someone in that audience taught 4th graders, and she invited us to come to her school the next morning, and she paid us some money. First money we made as professional storytellers. And then it started spreading. Friends started telling other people about us. They wrote letters to coffee houses and festivals saying they ought to hire these 2 young women. The word started spreading. We started traveling throughout New England, telling at coffee houses and such. And then we started being invited to the folk festivals. And they didn't just put us in the tent for children. They put us right on main stage. Sometimes 10,000, 20,000 people all across Canada we went. Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver, and then across the United States, Philadelphia Folk Festival, out to California, Chicago. And the word just kept spreading. It was really like magic. And always, whenever I got behind a microphone, first thing I did after I'd said hello and Barbara and I'd chatted just a bit, first thing I'd do is tell them about Jonesboro and how they ought to come down here and hear stories first weekend in October. And I was always looking for storytellers, someone I thought that could get on stage. Of course, our stages then were just in the grass. But, eventually they kept building until we had something more like this. And I was always on the lookout in those early days for anyone that I thought might do well here in Jonesboro. I saw Ed Stivender on a rooftop in Connecticut, invited him to come down. David Holt, Jackie Torrance, Donald Davis, I found in a little living room down at the Brasstown Folk School. And then there was others, Gamble Rogers, Utah Phillips, music stars in the folk music world. But they wanted to come down here to Jonesboro to express and to experience this whole happening because of what Jimmy Neal was doing here in Jonesboro. It was like this magical circle. Jimmy Neal here attending to all the details, getting the money, getting the town, getting the whole state involved in this festival. Me traveling around everywhere and inviting people to come, finding storytellers. And Ray, being Ray. People were hungry for stories. The timing was just right. A wondrous circle it was. Well, now, every time Barbara and I got close to where the Hicks lived on Beach Mountain, we'd slip over there to visit. Now, you never knew if they'd be home because they still didn't have a telephone. But we'd slip over to visit, and we would pull up at the top of the road there, and I remember hearing Ray go, "Hey, Lo!" We'd say, "Hey, Ray!" And Rosa would come up and give us big hugs. Then we'd walk around her garden, looking at all the pretty blooming flowers. She'd show us where her dahlias were going to be coming up. Well, one spring of the year, we were there, and we'd been having major troubles with our truck. Had a busted head gasket. That cost a lot of money, and we didn't have enough money to get it fixed at the time. So what we would do, we would always watch that temperature gauge. That's what happens with a busted head gasket. Your temperature starts getting real hot, the whole engine. We'd watch. As soon as it started heading up towards hot, we'd pull off the side of the road. We carried buckets of water and gallon jugs of water. We'd cool off the engine, sit there for a while, put in a little more antifreeze, and then we'd start driving again. Well, this particular time, we just left our troubles up there on the road and came to visit the Hicks. As soon as we got down to the front porch, Ray was there waiting, and right away he started in telling. Barbara and I had a system. One of us would sit with Ray, and the other would go into the kitchen to catch up with Rosa. And then at some point, we would swap off. Well, on this particular day, after we'd been there visiting for a good while, Rosa and I came out of the kitchen onto the front porch, and I said, "Barbara, we got to go." And Ray kept telling. And I said, "Rosa, tell Ray we got to go." And then the four of us stood up, and we started walking up the hill there towards the truck. We got up to the top, and I heard Ray say, "Pop the hood." It was the first time I'd ever heard Ray say ordinary words. I'd never heard him say anything that wasn't a story. I was stunned. I stood there, and then it kind of registered. Barbara opened the truck cab door and got in and popped the hood, and Ray pulled it up and started looking down, looking around, moving his hands. Rosa and me and Barbara were standing in a line watching Ray. Rosa turned to us and she said, "Listen, he's quiet." That was unusual. Ray touched a few more things and put that hood down and said, "That's got it." And we did our hugs, got in the truck, and we headed out. Now, our normal, when you first leave, it's kind of downhill, and then as soon as it started uphill, we went back to our normal train system of watching that gauge, and it never did go up. We put another 50,000 miles on that truck. Never did have to have that head gasket replaced. We got a touch of Ray's magic that day and lots of other days. Now, Ray was and still is a national treasure. In 1983, he was invited. Sounds like something's happening different with the mic. Anything? Are we okay? It's fuzzy now. Can we? It's fuzzy out here, people are saying. So let's see if we can get back. Do I need to go back to the other story about Oliver Hyde and test it out here? So is it here? Good here? Good here? And we're back to where we are? Okay, so coming back to Ray being a national treasure, in 1983, he was invited to come to Washington, D.C. with Rosa, and he was awarded the highest honor the President of the United States can give to a folk artist, the National Heritage Award. Later, Ray told me, they put him up in a big fancy hotel, and first time Ray had ever ridden an escalator, first time on an elevator. And he told me with kind of a wink, he said, "Connie, that revolving door, I got lost for 2 days." Well, I continued visiting Ray very often. And the folk tellers, that's what Barbara and I were called. After we had done 20 years together, 1995, we decided to open different doors for each other, and we went our solo ways. And right at that moment, I got another gift from the universe. The Kandinsky Trio invited me, they were a chamber music piano trio. They invited me as a storyteller. They got a composer because they had gotten a grant to have original chamber music written to a traditional mountain story. And they asked me to do it. We connected right away and enjoyed each other so much, we thought of ourselves as a quartet on stage, all telling the story in different times, in different ways. We picked Wicked John and the Devil, that story that Ray had told as we were walking through town. We called it the Cantankerous Blacksmith, and we did over 200 performances of it. Great reviews, too. Now, my dream, my fantasy, was to have Ray and Rosa come to one of those performances. And I saw that we were booked at Appalachian State in their beautiful concert hall. That's the closest place in Boone, closest place to where the Hicks live. So I wrote them a letter, still no telephone. And I told them about this piano, cello, and violin, how we'd all be on stage, all telling Ray's story. And I invited them to come. I had arranged for a family member to bring them down to Boone if they wanted to come. And I told them there'd be 2 tickets waiting for them there. Well, I didn't get my hopes up. And that evening, we were backstage. That must be Ray just saying hello. That's what I'm assuming. That evening at Appalachian State, we were backstage all dressed in our finery, and the announcer introduced us, and we walked out into this beautiful stage, grand piano right there. We were taking our bows, and in the second row, I spotted Ray, right in the middle, no back row for him. He was sitting right next to Rosa. Ray had on his bib overalls with a can of tobacco on one pocket and a harmonica on the other. Always had that on. And we started in. The piano played a few notes. And then the violin started picking it up. The cello came up, gave us a hint of what this story was going to be. And then I started in. The cantankerous blacksmith, living up in the mountains. He is a blacksmith working over hot coals of fire all day. And he is mean, ornery, an uppity blacksmith. Telling about how he came to be known as the meanest man in the world, and the devil come to hear about it. And the devil thought it wouldn't do having somebody meaner than him. So he sent one of his little boys to fetch Wicked John. Well, Ray, right instantly was into that story. He was living it like it was inside his body, like it was the first time he had ever heard it. This unconventional telling of one of his traditional stories that he had taught me. I almost burst with joy. And afterwards, I went out and met Ray and Rosa and the family, and we headed for the parking garage. And we got to the top steps, and Ray said, "Connie, don't let them forget about me. You keep a-telling." We walked down the steps. Rosa got in the car and the others, and Ray was standing there looking at me, and he said, "Connie, tell on, tell on." And that night, when I was drifting off to sleep, I was thinking about that, tell on, tell on. And I remembered the truck when he had said, "That's got it." And I knew I'd been blessed. Ray had given me his blessing, and I'd had another real moment of magic. Now, it was a few years after that, 2001, that Ray was diagnosed with cancer over in Johnson City. It was very advanced, and the doctor said they were going to send him home, and they suggested hospice. Now, one of the things that hospice needed was a telephone. Ray never wanted one of those newfangled things, but he agreed, and we got one put in real quick. And the hospice people, they fell in love with Ray and Rosa, with the whole family. They loved their old-timey ways and just went right into the rhythm of it. They'd help carry water from the spring house. If they had to sterilize anything, they'd help Rosa heat up the wood cook stove so they could get that water boiling. They could do that. They learned a lot from Ray and Rosa, and they grew to depend on Ray's wisdom. One day, one of the nurses had a little cut. Her contact had made a cut in her eye, and it got infected. And she'd tried antibiotics, been on heavy-duty ones, and she happened to mention it to Ray and Rosa while they were sitting around the kitchen table. Ray turned to Ted, the youngest son, told him to go out into the woods and bring back a small branch from a sassafras tree. Ted did that, and once it got in the kitchen, Ray sliced it down the middle. He took a knife and pulled out all that pulp, gave it to Rosa. She mixed up a poultice and gave it to the nurse. She took it home, and 2 days later, that nurse's eye was healed. They really loved Ray a lot. One time, I took a friend, Tim Tingle. He's a member of the Choctaw Nation, and he's a storyteller. I took him up there because he wanted to meet Ray. Well, I headed for the kitchen like I always did, and it wasn't long till I heard Ray saying, "Connie, Tim wants me to tell Wicked John. I'm not sure if I'm up for it." I told him, "You tell it." I said, "Ray, I'd be delighted to tell it. But why don't you start it, and then I'll pick up if you get tired." So, Ray started his telling about that Wicked John, about those 3 devils that had been sent up to get him, and how all 3 of them, including the devil himself, them old horns roached back over the top of his head, how he'd been caught up, all of them, been caught up in Wicked John's shenanigans, and they just left him up on earth, went back down there, you know. And then Ray got towards the end there, talking about those 3 little devils. They were playing pitch-paw with a hot coal of fire on the outside the gates of hell, and they saw Wicked John come walking down the road whistling. They ran, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy, come here quick. You ain't going to believe who's coming down the road." That devil got out there, "Bah, bar, knock these gates, boys. Get in here behind me." They were shaking and a-trembling, and Wicked John just walking down, hands in his pocket. He came right up to the gate and said, "Howdy, devil. I've come to visit." That devil said, "You just turn around and be put off, 'cause you ain't coming in here." "Well, confound," said Wicked John. "I was just up in heaven. St. Peter said I couldn't get in up there. Now you're telling me I can't get in down here? What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go?" Well, the devil didn't want that Wicked John outside his gates of hell all eternity. Then he got him an idea. He got him a long pair of tongs. He reached way back in that furnace, got him a big coal. He eased it through those gates, and he said, about that moment, Ray kind of winked at Tim and me. He said, he eased it through the gates there, and he said, "Here, old man, you take this here ball of fire. You go off and start a little hell of your own." Ray did not need me to tell one moment of that story that day. Now, another year passed, and Ray was still with us. Word had spread throughout the storytelling community. Lots of fundraising was going on. We were paying those land taxes and the telephone and other expenses that had come up. And I had told stories at a benefit for the Hicks family. It was up not too far from where they lived, so I thought, well, I'll just swing by and do a little visit. So I got there, and Ray was sitting up in bed in his striped pajamas. First thing he said was, "Connie, all creation is meant to wear out." And then he proved it wrong right there. He started in telling and laughing. I'd never seen his hands more beautiful, shaping out that story. Rosa brought in a big old plate of food. It had some boiled potatoes there and had some beans. And it was like Wicked John got, too, that for St. Peter. It was a similar bowl there. And right on the side was a big old chocolate moon pie. Ray was eating, and he was still telling. And then I didn't want to tire him out. It was getting late. I lived about 2 hours away, and it was a drive on very windy roads, up and down, all two-lane. And it was almost as if whenever I went up there, I never remembered how to go. That last 2 or 3 miles, I needed written directions of where to turn. It felt as if I was entering a fairy circle, this enchanted land. So I stood up and I told Ray, I said, "Ray, I gotta go." I had my purse on my shoulder, and he said, "Connie, let me sing you a song." And he started in. "Oh, poor wayfaring pilgrim, walking through this land of woe, there is no trouble and no hardship once I get to where I go." And the song kept going, all about meeting his mama, meeting his daddy. Within minutes, I was just weeping. I walked out into the darkness of that night, knowing I'd been gifted. Now, it was another whole season or two. Ray fell and broke his leg. It was real bad. They got him to the hospital, and Rosa called me the next morning, and she said, "Ray's a-going home." I knew what she meant. Now, that afternoon, there was family and friends there in the room with Ray, and there come a knock on the door. Soft knock. It was Tom Dennett, one of the hospice nurses. He and Ray had become good friends. They'd sing the old-time songs together and play the harmonica together. They were close. He came in and he walked over to Ray. He bit down and whispered in Ray's ear. No reaction. He brushed his cheek and went across his eyebrows, eyelashes. Nothing. Tom turned to the people in the room and said, "I don't know if I can do this, but I'm going to try." And he took out his harmonica. Thank you, Ray. The train is what Jonesboro Festival is all about. So Tom took out his harmonica and he started playing Amazing Grace. He's going through verse after verse. Tom was crying. Everybody in that room was crying. They'd been watching to see if maybe that was Ray's last breath as it went down and then up again. Everybody thought Tom was playing Ray out of this world. Tom came to that last note. He held it. But then Ray opened his eyes. He looked around. He opened his arms. That spirit, he said. And everybody started laughing, and what Rosa called a holy laugh, and crying too. Well, the next day after I got there back up there that evening, and Rosa and Dorothy Jean and I, we were going to sleep there for the night. That's when I found out, really, and understood Rosa had never spent a night away from Ray. The nurses brought us in some blankets, and we set out a little pallet there in the waiting room close to Ray's room. And we laid there in the darkness. We were talking and laughing, being sad together. Rosa pointed out the window there, and it was dark outside, and you could see a star. We all drifted off to sleep, making a wish for Ray's safe journey. It was 2 months later, on Easter Sunday, April 20th, 2003, Ray left this world. He passed away. And I often I think back to what an incredible influence he had on every one of us even being here. How it was that impetus, that who he was, being himself. That's what grew this storytelling revival. And of course, festivals started popping up all over there in every state in the United States and all across the world. And Ray, I think back to him telling me, asking me not to let folks forget about him. So I want to ask you, maybe some of the stories I've told tonight, you can maybe find out other stories about Ray and his life. Tell about Ray and Rosa. And also, tell those traditional stories, either the ones that Ray told or ones from your own tradition. Keep a-telling is what Ray asked us to do. And now, I also say to each one of you, tell on, tell on. Thank you.